Okay, so today we are going to be talking about plants. So sometimes this is a pretty overwhelming chapter for some people because there is a lot of new terminology associated with plants. So we'll go through it today, try to make sure we define everything. If you have any questions, obviously let me know. But keep in mind that I'm aware this is a lot of information being presented all at once, but I believe in you guys to piece it apart and figure out the major trends that we're observing here. So if you watched the video about the microbe diversity, I kind of talked about these diversity chapters in general and how when you are trying to work with this big amount of information, it really helps to focus on the major groups that I'm going to talk about, what distinguishes those groups from other groups, how do they fit together evolutionarily, what characteristics do these later groups have that these early groups don't? So that's really what we're going to want to focus on. Okay. So in general, this plant kingdom is a huge kingdom. There's a ton of variation that we see in this group, close to 300,000 different species. And sort of as they have evolved, they have developed adaptations to be on land. So the early plants that we see were completely dependent on the water, and now they have evolved to live in some pretty dry places, right? We think of cactuses that live in the desert. Plants that have evolved these adaptations to be a little bit more distant from the water. They're all photosynthetic organisms, so they can produce their own food. They have cell walls made of cellulose. So some of the microbes that we talked about had cell walls as well, but these are different kinds of cell walls made of cellulose. They have a really interesting type of life cycle, which we're going to go over. It's called an alternations of generations life cycle. So this is something that all plants do. It may look a little different in some plants compared to other plants, but they all do alternate their generations in their life cycle. And they have something called indeterminate growth. So they never actually stop growing. They don't live forever, but if they did, they would just keep getting bigger. So when it comes to this alternation of generations life cycle, we're going to kind of break down the image that's in your textbook piece by piece, and then talk about the whole cycle. This is just a generalized alternation of generations life cycle. So the first part of this life cycle looks like other parts of other life cycles that we've talked about, right? We have two gametes here that fuse together or fertilize together to form a unicellular diploid zygote. So two haploid gametes forming a diploid zygote. This looks very similar to the other types of life cycles that we've talked about. From there, in this alternation of generations life cycle, this unicellular zygote, so single-celled diploid structure, is going to undergo mitosis to increase in cell number. So this also looks very similar, right? When our unicellular zygote grows into a multicellular structure, it's undergoing mitosis. In plants, that structure that's created is called a sporophyte. So a sporophyte is this multicellular diploid structure. So this is a word that's unique to this alternation of generations life cycle. This plant, it's a very planty word right here, sporophyte, and it just means multicellular diploid structure. Okay, so our unicellular zygote undergoes mitosis to create this multicellular sporophyte. From there, in our sporophyte, there's a certain part of our sporophyte that's going to undergo meiosis to create spores. Okay, so whenever we're talking about meiosis, remember that we're going from one single cell that's a diploid and going into four cells that are haploid. So a diploid cell going to four haploid cells, that's meiosis. So that's what's happening here. The four cells that are produced are referred to as spores. So our sporophyte is creating spores through meiosis, right? Going from diploid to haploid. And then our spores are going to undergo mitosis here. So we have our single-celled haploid structures that are going to undergo mitosis to change their cell number and turn into what we call the gametophyte. The gametophyte here is the multicellular haploid structure. So we had a multicellular diploid structure down here. We have a multicellular haploid structure up here. So this is something that, like, if you think of humans, we don't have this, right? The only haploid cells that we have in our bodies are eggs and sperm. and those fuse together to create that zygote, and they themselves are the products of meiosis. But here, in between the products of meiosis and fertilization, we have this other stuff going on. We have the creation of this multi-celled haploid structure. So this is overall the alternation of generations life cycle. So I've added a few words here. I think it's important to understand that these gametes, like in humans, our gametes are the products of meiosis, but here they're actually the products of mitosis. The gametophyte is creating these gametes through mitosis. And the way that I think is easy to remember this is anytime we're changing the cell number, but not changing the amount of genetic information, it's always going to be mitosis. Meiosis is only used when we're decreasing the amount of genetic information. So you can pretty much put mitosis on any part of this life cycle that's not meiosis over here and fertilization or fusion over here. Everything else is mitosis. Zygote, increasing in cell number to the sporophyte, the spores increasing in cell number to the gametophyte, the gametophytes decreasing in cell number to the gametes. All of those are mitosis because the amount of genetic information we have is not changing. But then over here, once we cross from this diploid section into this haploid section, that's meiosis. And then when we go from the haploid section down to the diploid section, that's fertilization. Okay? And then I also added this word down here, sporangia. This is basically just the part of the sporophyte where meiosis happens. So where the spores are developed on the sporophyte is called the sporangia. Okay. So to summarize the alternation of generations life cycle, it's an alternation of these haploid and diploid generations. So they're going to be haploid, then they're going to be diploid, then they're going to be haploid again. They're just alternating back and forth between these haploid and diploid stages. So you're definitely going to need to learn the words gametophyte and sporophyte. So again, the gametophyte is this haploid structure that produces gametes, and those gametes are produced via mitosis. And then the sporophyte is our diploid structure that produces our spores via meiosis. So gametes produced by mitosis is different than what we're used to thinking about. And then we have now the creation of these spores by meiosis. There are 4 main plant groups that you're going to need to know, and we'll kind of talk about one, and then as we go into our different groups, we'll talk about the adaptations that are new to that group evolutionarily. But those 4 main groups, we've got the bryophytes, so this is going to be non-vascular plants, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second. These are things like mosses. We have our seedless vascular plants. These are things like ferns. And then these 2 groups down here are seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. And we'll talk about those two groups when we get there. But basically, gymnosperms are mostly things like conifers, so pine trees, things like that. And then angiosperms are all of our flowering plants. So this, I believe this is from your textbook, but it's just kind of a chart that breaks down the major divisions in the plant groups. So the first division that we see is going to be between our non-vascular plants, our bryophytes, and our vascular plants. That's the first big split we see in the evolution of land plants. Okay, so these bryophytes do not have vascular tissue. These are things like xylem and phloem that move water and nutrients around the plant. And we've got a figure on that in a couple slides, what those structures actually look like. So some plants don't have those structures, some plants do. So within the plants that do have those structures, our vascular plants, we see another main split. And that split is going to be plants that have seeds and plants that don't have seeds. So within our vascular plants, we have seedless vascular plants and we have seed vascular plants. And then within our seed plants, we have our gymnosperms, things like pine trees, and we have our angiosperms, anything that has a flower. Okay, so those are the big divisions, vascular versus non-vascular, seed versus seedless, gymnosperms versus angiosperms. So if you kind of expand those columns, you can see the types of plants that are in each of these groups. So we'll talk about these a little bit, but this is what I really want you to understand as far as how this division of land plants goes. What are those major splits in land plant evolution? And then this is the 4 plant groups just kind of on a cladogram here. So this is just basically a timeline that's showing us the evolution of these groups. So we've got all of our groups up at the top, and then down here we have the addition of new traits, these derived characteristics. So all land plants evolved from this green algal ancestor. And then those green algae ancestors were called charophytes right here. And then now these are going to be our terrestrial plants starting here. Once we start to see terrestrial adaptations, this is where we're getting our plants. So we have the evolution of our non-vascular plants first. Then we have the addition of vascular tissue to get our seedless vascular plants. Then we have the addition of seeds and pollen for our seed plants. And then our flowering plants have some unique adaptations. Things like flowers and fruits are unique to that group. So this is a cladogram, so it's going to be important to understand how to read these cladograms, how to build these cladograms. So make sure that if you are given these groups and these characteristics, you're able to piece them together on this evolutionary timeline. And this is just another figure kind of showing the 4 main plant groups and showing the alternation of generations in each group as far as the amount of time or basically the dominant generation is that sporophyte, that diploid stage dominant versus that haploid gametophyte stage, because in different plants it looks a little different. So when we think about our gymnosperms and angiosperms, so our conifers and then our flowering plants, this is the majority of plants that you see when you walk outside. When we think about those types of plants, the dominant generation is the sporophyte generation. When you look outside and you see a tree, that's a diploid structure. That is a 2N sporophyte structure. Okay? But then down here, when we look at our mosses have a generation that's dominant in the gametophyte stage. So when you look at a moss, basically what you're seeing is a gametophyte, a haploid structure. So the green leafy bits down here, this is the gametophyte. And then the sporophyte is completely dependent on this gametophyte. Okay, so this is our dominant generation here. Our ferns, our seedless vascular plants, are kind of in the middle. When you think about a fern, what you're looking at is the sporophyte, but their gametophytes are completely independent photosynthetic structures that are not microscopic. You can see these with the naked eye, but when we get up here further in evolution, these become microscopic gametophytes. So this alternation of generations is shifting as we progress in plant evolution. So let's talk about our bryophytes first. So these are our non-vascular plants. So these are going to be our most primitive plants, but they do still have some adaptations for being terrestrial. So the main adaptation that they have is a cuticle. So all plants have this, all land plants have this structure, a cuticle. Basically just a waxy covering on the outside of the plant to prevent water from leaving the plant. Right? If we're in the water, we don't need to worry about water leaving because there's water all around us. But if we are out in the air, we don't want the water we have on the inside of our plant bodies to leave and go back into the air environment, right? So we want to keep the water that we have. So this cuticle is going to help us keep the water, preventing that water from diffusing out of our cells. And in this group, we're still requiring water for sexual reproduction. So even though we have this cuticle to help us live in a terrestrial environment, we're still dependent on the water for sexual reproduction. So we're not quite independent from the water yet. We still kind of need it for this one aspect of our life. And in this group, we have the gametophyte. So this haploid structure, this multicelled haploid structure is dominant and photosynthetic, right? It can make its own food. And then the sporophytes, our multicellular diploid structure, is going to depend on this gametophyte for nutrition. So our gametophyte is dominant, our sporophyte depends on it for nutrition. And then this gametophyte is going to be anchored into the ground by structures called rhizoids. It's basically like a root. Like you look at it and you're going to think to yourself that it's a root, but it's not exactly a root because it's for a gametophyte. So the rhizoids are this anchoring structure for a gametophyte. So not quite roots yet, but we do have these structures that are still going to anchor them into the ground. This is just a description of the gametophyte and the sporophyte in these bryophyte structures. And it can look a little different depending on which bryophyte you're talking about. But this is just going to be a moss structure here. So we have our gametophytes down at the bottom. These green leafy structures are going to be our gametophytes, which again are responsible for producing gametes. And then out of the top of our gametophyte, we're getting our sporophyte produced. And this is what is responsible for producing the spores. Okay, so these spores are going to be released. The spores grow into these gametophyte structures through mitosis, right? These are haploid spores. These are haploid multicellular structures. So these spores are going to land somewhere, develop into these gametophytes. That sporophyte completely dependent on this gametophyte. This structure is not photosynthetic. It has to rely on these photosynthetic gametophytes for its nutrition. And here, this is our alternation of generations life cycle. So it's just like our basic diagram that we saw before, except this is bryophyte specific. So in this structure, this is just kind of some notes over here. Our gametophyte is going to be our large structure. Our sporophyte is going to be smaller and dependent on that gametophyte. And we're requiring water. Okay, so let's just talk through this a little bit. So let's start over here with our zygote. So we have our gametes that fertilize together to produce our single-celled diploid structure, which is our zygote. This zygote undergoes mitosis, right? We're changing the cell number, but not the amount of genetic information to produce this sporophyte here. And remember that the sporophyte is just the structure on the top, not this part down here. That sporophyte is going to be producing this capsule where our spores are produced via meiosis. So meiosis is producing our spores. Our spores land on the ground and grow through mitosis into our multicellular haploid structure, the gametophyte. And then we have sperm and egg that are produced within our gametophyte through mitosis, right? These sperm and egg are haploid. These gametophytes are haploid. So this is mitosis. And then those egg and sperm will fuse to make our zygote, right? It's just like we talked about in that basic diagram. This is just moss specific. When we talk about the diversity that we see in bryophytes, so it's not important to me that you know specific examples of species of bryophytes, but it is important for me that you know what types of plants are considered bryophytes. So things like mosses, so any mosses are going to be bryophytes. That's going to be the main group here. So this is another moss down here. But we also have some other plants. So these are bryophytes called hornworts. And then these are bryophytes over here called liverworts. So liverworts, hornworts, and mosses are going to be the non-vascular plants. There's another video that I'm going to post on D2L that talks about bryophyte diversity. So feel free to check that out if you would like. So now we are moving on from our non-vascular plants, and we're going to be focusing on our vascular plants. So these are plants that have this vascular tissue. So when we see this split, we're going to get some new traits that weren't seen in bryophytes, but now we have in our land plants. So the first is going to be this vascular tissue. So the vascular tissue is specialized structures that are functioning to move water and nutrients through the plant. So we have xylem. So this is xylem over here, transport of water. And then we have phloem over here. This is the transport of sugars, proteins, and other nutrients. Okay, so here we have one-way transport. So we've got water going from the roots where it's absorbing water through through the ground, and it's taking that water and delivering it to the other parts of the plant, to those photosynthetic leaves up at the top of the plant. So this one-way flow of water. But then in our phloem, we actually have a two-way flow. We've got some nutrients coming up from the roots up to the rest of the plant. And then we've got some food that's created in these photosynthetic structures, our glucose molecules, that are going back down to the roots to feed those cells. So with our xylem, it's just basically like a tube. There's no ends between the cells. But over here, we do have these cells that end, but there are perforations in these ends of the cells that allow the water and the food to go through. So a little bit different in the structures that we see. The xylem focusing on the transport of water in one direction, the phloem focusing on the transport of food in two directions. We also see the evolution of roots. So our bryophytes, our non-vascular plants, did not have roots, right? They had those rhizoids to anchor them, but they didn't have roots. So roots are going to allow the plant to uptake water from the soil, and they're going to anchor this. And then they can also form, so if you've listened to the microbe lecture, there's this symbiotic relationship that fungi have with plants called mycorrhizae. And this is where the structure of the fungi interacts with the structure of the roots, and they basically have this mutualistic relationship. So mutualistic relationships is a type of symbiotic relationship where both individuals involved in the relationship are going to benefit. So fungi have this great ability to decompose organic matter and release nutrients that otherwise would be trapped in the organic matter. So fungi have access to all these great nutrients. So they're going to give nutrients to the plant through this relationship with the roots. And the plant, in turn, is going to provide food for the cells of the fungi. Fungi cannot make their own food. They are heterotrophic. So they're getting food from the plant, but providing nutrients to the plant, this mutualistic symbiotic relationship that happens down here at the roots. So with the evolution of roots, we allowed for this evolution of this symbiotic relationship. And then we also have the evolution of true leaves. So you kind of saw in the bryophytes, there were some green leafy bits for that gametophyte, right? But they're not actual leaves that we think of when we think of leaves. So this evolution of true leaves is going to allow for much greater photosynthetic efficiency. So we're going to talk about our seedless vascular plants first, and then we'll talk about our vascular plants that have seeds. So with our seedless vascular plants, we have these new adaptations that we talked about on the previous slide, the evolution of roots, the evolution of true leaves, the evolution of vascular tissue. All of those things are going to allow these plants to be bigger, right? Our mosses, our other bryophytes, very small, but now we're able to grow bigger because we have these new evolutionary adaptations to allow us to do that. So seedless vascular plants were pretty much, the only plants that were dominating the landscape until we had the evolution of seed plants. So I believe it's in like the Carboniferous period where we see a really dominant seedless vascular plant timeline. And then a lot of the seedless vascular plants that existed in those previous eras are now what have been turned into things like fossil fuels. So we have these seedless vascular plants that were really dominant in the environment back in the Carboniferous period. So even though we are, coming up with these new adaptations for terrestrial life, we still do need water for reproduction. I guess I didn't mention that, which I should have. In our bryophytes, the reason that we need water for reproduction, for sexual reproduction, is because the sperm are flagellated and have to swim through the water to get to the egg. Okay, so this is the same thing is happening in our seedless vascular plants. The reason that we need water for sexual reproduction is because the sperm has to swim to the egg. All right. So even though these seedless vascular plants are more adapted to terrestrial life, they're still going to favor these moist areas because they still need water for that sperm to swim to the egg in sexual reproduction. So here we have our alternation of generations life cycle, just like we did in our bryophytes, except this one is going to be seedless vascular plant specific. Okay, So here we've got our zygote over here, our single-celled diploid structure that's going to undergo mitosis to produce our sporophyte, our multicellular diploid structure. We've got the sporangia here. Typically on ferns, it's located on the underside of that frond. You see these little sori that contain the sporangia. That's where the spores are produced via meiosis. So the spores are produced via meiosis. These spores are going to undergo mitosis to increase in cell number and form this multicellular haploid structure, the gametophyte. And then in our gametophyte, we have the production of our egg and sperm, our gametes, via mitosis. These gametes fuse together to form our zygote. Okay, this part right here is what's requiring water. So we have a large sporophyte now. So this is different than we saw in the bryophytes. We have a smaller gametophyte, but it's photosynthetic, and we can still see it with our eyes. So in the next groups, we're going to see a shift where our gametophyte becomes microscopic, but it's not microscopic yet. So this is kind of in between our bryophytes and our seed plants, where we're a dominant sporophyte generation here, but this is still independent, photosynthetic. So it's a little bit in between the other groups. When it comes to the diversity of our seedless vascular plants, the biggest group within our seedless vascular plants is going to be ferns. So if you've been up to the Pacific Northwest and hiked around that area, I'm sure you've seen a lot of ferns. These really thrive in moist environments. So that's going to be where the majority of the diversity that we see comes from. But we also have things like horsetails. So this is an example of a horsetail right here. We have this stem with sort of these whorls of really small leafy structures there. This is an example of what's called a whisk fern. So this is another type of seedless vascular plant. And then we can also have things like club mosses. So even though it says the word moss here, it's not actually a moss. It is a seedless vascular plant. Club mosses are pretty interesting. A lot of them are parasitic plants. So we get some interesting plants happening there. So club mosses, horsetails, and ferns, those are going to be these seedless vascular plants. So now we are moving on from our seedless vascular plants. We're going to be talking about our seed vascular plants. So this is the next big split that we have. So there are some new traits that we're getting with our seed plants that we didn't have in our seedless plants. So we have our further reduction of the gametophyte. So here, this is what we saw in our seedless vascular plants, where we had our dominant sporophyte, but we had this larger gametophyte structure. We can still see it, and it's photosynthetic. But now, in our seed plants, our gametophyte is going down to this microscopic cluster of cells. So it is completely dependent on this sporophyte. It can't live on its own like this gametophyte did down here. So now our gametophyte is just reduced to this cluster of cells in the plant rather than a free living structure. And this slide here, I wanted to throw this in because this does a really great job of comparing and contrasting the sporophyte and gametophyte stages in the different plant groups. We kind of saw this a little bit before in a different figure, but I wanted to throw this one in here as well, just again to remind you sort of which one has the dominant generation. So in our mosses, our bryophytes, our gametophyte is dominant and our sporophyte is reduced and dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. In our ferns and other seedless vascular plants, we have our sporophyte that's dominant. Our gametophyte is reduced, but it's independent. Okay, photosynthetic, free-living gametophyte right here. And then in our seed plants, we have this dominant sporophyte, and then our gametophyte is reduced and dependent on the sporophyte for nutrition. So we kind of get a flip-flop here in our seed plants from what we saw in our bryophytes, our non-vascular plants here. So another thing that we get with our seed plants is the addition of pollen and seeds, right? We didn't have seeds before, now we have them. We didn't have pollen before, but now we have it. So this is something that we see with our seed plants here. So with the addition of pollen and seeds, we are releasing ourselves from our dependency on water for reproduction and the development of our embryo. Okay, so this is a big step in colonizing a lot of places that weren't able to be colonized before because we were dependent on water, right? But now that we're not, we can spread out to new areas that plants weren't able to go to before. So pollen is what's going to be carrying the male gametes here. And the pollen helps prevent these gametes from drying out. So desiccation here, just the act of drying out. So the pollen, the coating around the pollen is going to prevent these gametes from doing that. And our seed is going to protect our embryo that's developing. And it's going to provide nourishment for that embryo that's developing. So now we don't need water to carry our sperm, our male gametes, right? We have pollen to do that. And we don't need water for this embryo to develop because the embryo has all of the nourishment, nutrients, water, everything that it needs within the seed. So we don't need we don't have this dependency on water like we did before. So let's talk about our gymnosperms first. So remember, in our seed plants, we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. So we'll talk about our gymnosperms first. The word gymnosperm just means naked seed. It basically is saying that, yes, this plant has a seed, but that seed's not quite closed up. So it's not a fully enclosed seed. Gymnosperms are primarily pollinated by wind. So these are primarily going to be wind pollinated organisms. This shifts a little bit when we move into our angiosperms. And this is a kind of a weird group because the plants that we have in this group aren't actually related closely, evolutionarily speaking, but they have very common seed developments and they have very common vascular tissue systems. So they're all kind of grouped together, but they're very different. And you'll see that when we look at the different examples, which are right here. So the biggest group that we have are the conifers. So we're all familiar with conifers here in Colorado. So these are some pictures of some conifers there. Some of the biggest plants that we see on Earth are conifers, right? The giant trees we see out in California, pictured here. These are conifers. But we have some other gymnosperms that aren't conifers. So we have these types of plants down here. These are called cycads. So they're kind of low to the ground and they have these giant cones in the middle with these big fronds coming off. These plants here, this is a group called cnidophytes. So we've got some plants here, look very different than our conifers. And then we also have ginkgo. So ginkgo is in a family all by itself. It's just this one species, which is very unusual for a family of individuals to only consist of one species. Generally, it's many species belonging to many genera or genuses, right? But it's just this one species of ginkgo. Okay, so they have these really unique types of leaves here. These are often used in landscaping because they are, they keep these green leaves and they're very beautiful. There are different male and female plants. So this right here is a male plant. The female plants are very, very rarely used in landscaping because they actually smell horrible. But the males do not, so they are used quite often in landscaping. Okay, so this is not actually information that's in the chapter, but I just think it's important to talk about since we do live in Colorado and we are surrounded by conifers. I think it's very important to talk about the fact that they're not all pine trees. So this is just a slide that I threw in here to kind of give you some information about the types of conifers you might see if you're out for a hike so that you can know which one is a pine tree, which one's not a pine tree. So you can tell based on the needles and on the cones. So there are three main types of conifers that you might see. You might see fir trees, you might see spruce trees, you might see pine trees. Okay, so when it comes to the needles of fir trees are individually attached to the branch. So each needle is going to be attached to that branch. They're also very soft, very pliable. You can kind of move them around, and they're flat. Okay, so you can't easily like roll them in between your fingers because they're flat. Okay. You see a lot of fir trees when people are, selling Christmas trees, right? The Douglas fir is a big Christmas tree. So that's a fir tree there with those flat needles. Spruce trees here, we still have needles that are individually attached to the branch, but they're really pointy. So if you've like brushed up against a conifer and it hurts, that was probably a spruce. And these needles are square. So each of these needles are square. They've got edges to them, so you can easily kind of roll them back and forth in between your fingers. And then our pine trees, these are not individually attached to the branch, these needles. They generally come in clusters of 2, 3, or 5. And depending on how many are in the cluster, they can vary, by the species. But you're going to see that clustering of needles on the tree, on that branch. And then our cones are different also. So fir cones look like this. They stand upright on the tree, and they actually break apart on the tree. They don't fall off whole. And then with our spruce trees, these are going to be thin and flexible cones that hang down and then fall from the tree. So if you find a cone on the ground that's kind of flexible, it's not really woody, that's a spruce cone. So it's not a pine cone, it's a spruce cone. And then pine cones, we all are familiar with pine cones, right? They're woody, they fall down from the tree whole. So that's going to be what our pine cones look like, but our spruce cones look a little bit different. Okay, so if you are spending some time outside during this quarantine and are taking a look at the conifers around you, you can impress all the people you are quarantined with by telling them the difference between firs, spruces, and pines. Okay, so within our gymnosperms, we're primarily talking about conifers here. This is the largest, most dominant group within our gymnosperm. So this is primarily what we're going to be talking about. So the sporophyte is large, right? The tree is our sporophyte structure. The gametophytes are now microscopic. So they are going to be inside of the cones. The gametophytes are inside of those cones. And we have male and female cones, right? We've got gametophytes that are producing gametes. So we've got female gametes being produced and male gametes being produced. This is going to happen in separate cones. So typically when you see a conifer, we've got female cones that are up at the top, and we've got male cones that are more towards the bottom and out on the edges of the branches. So if we think about why that is, why are male cones below the female cones? So this is basically to prevent self-fertilization. So this plant has the ability to self-fertilize. These male cones have the ability to fertilize the female cones, but that's not ideal. We don't want to self-fertilize if we don't have to. It's much better for us to cross-fertilize with another individual. So to help prevent self-fertilization, these male cones are going to be below the female cones. If the male cones were up here and the female cones were down here, the pollen would just fall off of the male cones directly onto the female cones, and they would all get fertilized. Okay, so we're trying to prevent that from happening. So these male cones are going to be lower on the branches. And if you ever see a conifer with male cones, even just the slightest tap of those branches is going to cause pollen to go everywhere. So if those male cones were up here, all of the female cones down here would definitely get pollinated. And then we also see male cones at the ends of the branches. So if we think about why the male cones would be on the ends of the branches, that has to do with how they're pollinated, right? Gymnosperms are wind pollinated. They're relying on the wind to pick up the pollen and move it to a new location and hopefully meet up with another tree. So if the male cones are at the edges of these branches, that's going to allow the wind to more easily pick up the pollen and take it where it needs to go. If the male cones were on the inside of the branches here, they would be much more protected from the wind and wouldn't be able to distribute their pollen as easily. Okay, so we see some evolutionary things that have happened here where cones are located on the tree that kind of shows us how this fertilization works, how this reproduction works. Okay, so let's move on to angiosperms here. So we've talked about our gymnosperms. Now we're going to talk about our angiosperms. So we're still seed plants, right? We still have seeds and pollen and vascular tissue and all of those things we've talked about before. This is the most dominant group that we see on the planet. over 250,000 species. In the first slide, I mentioned that there's around 300,000 species of plants. 250,000 of those are angiosperms, right? So pretty much when you walk outside and look at a plant, there's a good chance that it's going to be an angiosperm. Anything with a flower is an angiosperm. So our crops are angiosperms, flowers are angiosperms, all of those fruit trees that we rely on are angiosperms. So this is a very, very dominant group. And we see with this group, we see some traits that we didn't see in gymnosperms. And this is going to be our flowers and our fruits. Okay, so the flowers allow us to rely on some animals now for pollination. Rather than just relying on the wind, we can attract some animals with our brightly colored flowers to help pollinate. And then we also have fruits. So this is going to be protecting our embryo that's developing, protecting our seed, and this is also helping with dispersal, right? And this can help with dispersal in a few different ways, and we'll talk about that on the fruit slide. But this is going to be helping move these seeds around. So when we look at our flower, these are basically just modified leaves, and a lot of flowers look very different, but they have the same common structure, some of the same structures we see in all these different types of flowers. So we've got sepals. So sepals are going to be down here. These are typically photosynthetic structures that are covering the flower, the bud, before it opens up. So you see like a bud on a rose bush or any flowering plant. The flower is not open yet. That green part that's covering up that developing flower, those are our sepals down here. Typically, these are green and photosynthetic, but sometimes they can actually have some color on them as well. We also have petals. So our petals up here, typically going to be brightly colored. They're brightly colored to attract animals, right? To attract bees or other pollinators to them, right? This is what's allowing us to, employ animals to help do some of our pollination. Coming to this flower, then they're going to go to another flower and move pollen from one to another. And then we have pistils. So pistils are the female reproductive parts of the flower. So that's shown right here. We've got our pistil here. It's got a few different structures. It's got a stigma up at the top. This is typically going to be like a sticky structure, which allows pollen to stick to it, right? It wants to help capture the pollen. Then we have our style. So that's the tube that connects the stigma up at the top down to the ovary at the bottom. And the style is where the pollen is going to move from where it got stuck up here at the stigma down to our ovary. Because remember, the pollen has our male gametes in it. So we are going to take our male gametes down to our female gametes for fertilization. And then the stamen is our other main structure here. So this is the male part of the flower. So that's seen over here, and it's blown up on this section right here. So our stamens here have two main parts. They have the anther, which is where all of the pollen is produced and contained. And then we have a filament. Okay, so the filament is just the structure that is, connecting it down here to the rest of the flower. So we have our anther and our filament and our stamen, and then we have our pistil here. So a lot of flowers have both male and female structures, but again, we want to prevent self-fertilization if possible. We can do it if we have to, but we don't want to. So typically, this pistil is going to be taller than our stamens here, so that the pollen doesn't just fall on top of our stigma and get stuck up there. So typically, if a flower has both, this female structure is going to be taller than the male structure. So our fruits, we have a wide variety in the types of fruits that we see in angiosperms. Basically, what a fruit is just an ovary that is ripened. So it's protecting the seed, but it's also helping increase seed dispersal. So we've got, fruits that are developed here to help dispersal via wind, right? We also, like if you've taken your dog out for a hike and they come back with like burrs on them that are stuck to their fur, That's a type of fruit also. It's another type of dry fruit, helping in dispersal because it's getting stuck to an animal. That animal's taking it to a new place. Okay, so we've got these dry fruits up here. But then we also have fleshy fruits, right? And this is what we think of when we think of fruits. Still a pretty wide variety here of the types of fleshy fruits that we see. But this is going to be our fleshy fruits here. All of these are ripened ovaries. So we go back to our flower. This structure down here, this ovary on our pistil, that's what's becoming our fruit. And it is protecting the seed and helping with dispersal. That's the purpose of this fruit. Okay, so this is reproduction in an angiosperm. This looks complicated because it kind of is complicated. I don't want you to get bogged down in the detail of this figure. What I do want you to know is that this figure is just our alternation of generations life cycle. It's just focused on angiosperms, and angiosperm alternation of generations is a little bit more complicated. So we still have the big pieces of this, right? We've got our sperm and our egg that fertilize down here, right? We've got, the pollen gets stuck to the stigma. That male gamete comes down to fertilize our female gamete. So we have egg and sperm, haploid structures fertilizing to create this diploid zygote. This diploid zygote grows up to be our embryo that's developing in our seed, and then that seed turns into our sporophyte. So we still have our multicellular diploid structure, our sporophyte here. That's the result of mitosis. And then within our sporophyte, we have the development of our male spores and our female spores. Okay, so those spores are created via meiosis. But remember that these gametophytes are very, very, very tiny. They are microscopic. So they're still here, but they're just very, very tiny. And it's really only just a cluster of cells. Okay, so we have a large sporophyte. We have microscopic gametophytes, both male and female. Our zygotes are what are developing into our seeds, and our ovaries are what are developing into our fruits. Okay, our seed develops down here, and then this ovary is what becomes this fruit to protect that seed. Within our angiosperms, we have two main groups when it comes to the diversity. Those two groups are called monocots and dicots. So they're named monocot and dicot because of these structures called cotyledons. So these are basically little primitive leaves that are within the seed, so these seed leaves. In monocots, there is one, and in dicots, there is two. Okay, so monocots and dicots are grouped based on the presence of these little seed leaves. And then they also have some other structures that are common between all of them within these groups. So when it comes to our monocots, if we're looking at the veins on the leaves, these are usually parallel. But then in dicots, it's usually net-like. So if you think about a grass, has those parallel veins, that's going to be a monocot. But if you think about something like an oak tree, that's going to be a dicot. Within our stems, there's some differences with how the vascular tissue is organized. We see a pretty complex arrangement of the xylem and the phloem in our monocots, but down here in our dicots, it's arranged in a ring. So you see this ring-like structure of xylem and phloem there. With our roots, our monocots are going to have this fibrous root system. So this, really complex branching of roots. And then in our dicots, typically what we have is a taproot. So one big root going down with little roots coming out the side. So like a carrot is a great example of a taproot, right? It has this big structure going down and then little structures that come off of it. And then with our flowers, we also have differences. So monocots typically have flowers like petals that come in multiples of 3, flower parts in general. So the stamens and the pistils are also in these multiples of 3. And then in our dicots, it's usually multiples of 4 or 5. Okay, so we've got big differences in how plants look based on what group they belong to. This is just an example from your textbook talking about monocots and dicots. So within our crops, our food plants that we see, we have monocots and dicots. So all of our grasses, things like wheats, are going to be monocots, but then things like beans are dicots. And then down here, just some flowering plants. We've got monocots here. So this is a lily, and then we have a daisy here. That's a dicot. So here we're going to see flower parts in multiples of 3, and here we're going to see flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5. Okay, so there is a huge diversity of angiosperms. I'm not going to talk about all of them, obviously, if we have 250,000 species, but I did just want to talk about a few cool plants because there's a lot of cool plants out there. So we're just going to talk about a few. This is not important for testing purposes. This is really just me telling you about cool plants that exist in the world. So that's what these next few slides are for. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the corpse flower. So the corpse flower is super interesting. It's called a corpse flower because it smells like a rotting corpse. It smells absolutely terrible. And the reason it smells like a corpse is because it is trying to attract insects that feed on dead flesh. Okay, so if it smells like dead flesh, it will attract insects that feed on dead flesh. Okay, and this plant can actually warm itself up to like 98 degrees Fahrenheit to even further fool the insects into thinking that there's actually rotting flesh at this flower. It's one of the world's rarest flowers, and it's really, really big. It's about 10 to 15 feet tall. You can see that in this picture here, and it weighs about 200 pounds. So this is a ginormous flower, and it actually is one of the rarest flowers because it takes so long to bloom. It requires about 7 to 10 years of vegetative growth before it can bloom. So it's really rare to see it bloom. And then these blooms only last for about 24 to 48 hours. So when they do bloom, you get these giant crowds, right, to see it happen because it's not going to last for very long. So the Denver Botanic Gardens has one of these. It bloomed a couple years ago, I think back in 2017, maybe. So it's got a couple more years before it's going to bloom again. But typically when these are blooming, you hear about it in the news if it's local, because it does only happen, every 7 to 10 years. We also have carnivorous plants within angiosperms. So most people are familiar with the Venus flytrap. So these are native to North and South Carolina that have these little trigger hairs that, when are triggered, cause the plant to snap shut. So these trigger hairs need to be touched for about 20 seconds in order for the plant to actually close, because it doesn't want to close if it doesn't have to, right? It's energetically very expensive for this plant to close, and it takes about 5 to 12 days for it to reopen. So if it's shut, it wants to make sure that it knows what's in there. So these trigger hairs have to be touched for about 20 seconds for it to know, yes, there is an insect here. Yes, I should shut. And then it can start to digest those plants, or those insects rather. And then over here, these are pitcher plants. So pitcher plants are also carnivorous plants. They have this trumpet shape that has liquid down in here at the bottom. So it lures insects in with nectar, but then it has these bristles in here that kind of prevent them from leaving. And then when the insect can't leave, it just drowns in this liquid down here at the bottom. And then the insect is digested by these plant enzymes. So it's typically feeding on insects, but it can catch larger prey like things like mice and frogs as well. So here's a mouse being pulled out of a pitcher plant that got stuck and drowned in that liquid. And that plant would eat this mouse if somebody didn't pull it out. Some other angiosperms that we have, so all cactuses and succulents, those are all angiosperms. This is one of my favorite succulent. It's called the Lithops. It looks like rocks. So these are the plants right here that look like little rocks, and then these are the flowers that they produce. So I just think they're cool because they look like rocks. But there are lots of really cool succulents out there. This is just one of my favorites. So then this angiosperm here, these are called Victoria amazonica. These are giant water lilies. So they're up to 9 feet in diameter, so 9 feet across. You can see people standing on them over here. So these are really, really big. You can see that they have these edges that bend up on the sides. This is so that they don't overlap with their neighbors, right? They want to know where their neighbors are because they don't want to grow underneath where their neighbors are. So this is going to prevent them from overlapping there. And then on the underside of these giant lilies, they have these thorns that help prevent them from being eaten, right? There might be fish or things that are in the water that are going to try and snack on these giant lilies, but they've got thorns on the underside to help prevent that from happening. And the thing that's really cool about these is that they only flower at night. So the only time to see their flowers is at night. And the first night, their flowers are white and have female structures. And those female flowers can trap beetles inside. So the beetle lands and they trap it inside the flower. And then the next night, that flower opens back up and it's a male flower, and this beetle is covered in pollen and it can move on to the next flower. So there's really cool switch between male and female flowers in these giant water lilies. And then the last one I wanted to talk about, the African acacia tree, is this pretty iconic Saharan tree that you see in Africa. You typically associate it with things like giraffes, but this plant actually can communicate with other plants of its species through the release of this ethylene gas. So when these plants are preyed upon, when they're grazed upon, they release this cloud of ethylene gas. And then downwind, if there are trees of the species downwind, they pick up these ethylene gas molecules and it tells them to turn their leaves toxic to prevent grazing by animals. Okay, so one tree is getting grazed upon, it sends gas to the other trees downwind to say, hey, I'm being grazed upon, you should turn your leaves toxic. So they create all of these tannins in their leaves and turn their leaves toxic. And the reason that scientists figured this out is because there was this sudden death of about 3,000 antelope in a certain area. This area had antelopes and it had giraffes. And in this area, the giraffes were free roaming. They could just kind of go wherever they like, feed on whatever they like. But these antelope were enclosed in this fenced-in area. So the giraffes were roaming free, and they noticed that they were avoiding trees that were downwind. They would always go upwind to feed on their trees. But the antelope, when they're fenced in and they only have certain trees to feed on, if they happen to be downwind, those leaves are going to turn toxic, but they don't have anything else to eat, right? So in the wild, animals have learned to go upwind, but if they're forced to eat what they're forced to eat, it can cause this major die-off. So those are just some cool angiosperms that I wanted to show you guys. There are a million more, but those are generally, that's generally what I want you to know about plants. I want you to know those 4 groups of plants, what distinguishes each group from the next, and where they fit on that evolutionary timeline. So this is the only lecture we have for this week because I know it's a lot of information. So I will be around on Wednesday and Friday if you guys have questions, but that's all we have for this week. I will see you guys next week for the live lecture on Monday where we're going to talk about animals, which is another big lecture. So I'll stick around here in the meeting for a couple of minutes, and then I'll be here if you have any questions, but otherwise you guys are free to go.